Unfortunately, we know what comes next. We know folks are going to do everything they can to distort her truth. My husband and I sadly know a little something about this. For years, Donald Trump did everything in his power to try to make people fear us. See, his limited, narrow view of the world made him feel threatened by the existence of two hard-working, highly educated, successful people who happen to be black. I want to know, who's going to tell him that the job he's currently seeking might just be one of those black jobs?
Good morning, Quiet Rioters. I'm Alex Andreu. Welcome to a special US election edition of Quiet Riot Sunday School. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. I am slowly beginning to return to UK time after spending most of the week on Chicago time, up all night watching the Democratic National Convention. I have a few quick observations before we get into the show proper. Whatever happens in this election, the strength in depth that I have seen on display makes me extremely hopeful for the future and should be a source of succour and pride for all progressives. A lot of very smart young people with proper policy chops, as well as genuine flair and star quality, are among our ranks. Looking around that arena, I saw an America I recognise, the society I recognise. Diversity is strength, and that sort of strength can only be briefly suppressed, but not defeated. As the demographics of the country and the West more generally change, let reactionaries hold on to their sepia photographs of a past that never existed. Their violent reaction is but a final spasm. And possibly the most satisfying aspect of the convention was the challenging of narratives that have become far too embedded in our media. The praising of unions, the determination to take climate action, the reclamation of patriotism, the embrace of secularism, the rejection of dogma on what a family is supposed to look like, the respect for immigrants, the celebration of women, the projection of a different kind of masculinity. Let us not fool ourselves. This election is evenly matched, and if the last 6 weeks have taught anything, it is that nobody knows what might happen in the next 12. But the Democrats were 5-0 behind with half an hour to go, and they're back to level now. So the momentum is with them. You can feel it.
I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to know I was here at this moment, that we were here, and that we were with Kamala Harris every step of the way. This is our time, America. This is when we stand up. This is when we break through. The future is here. It's in our grasp. Let's go win it.
The truth is, I have never felt as intoxicated with democracy and the political process as I do right now. So I thought I had to get someone with a much more level head to talk some sense into me. I spoke to author, UCL politics professor and Quiet Riot regular, the peerless Brian Klaas. Hi, Brian.
Hey, it's great to be back.
You've been on the show proper since, but the first Sunday School we recorded was the day after the attempt on Trump's life, which, believe it or not, was only 6 weeks ago today.
It is a crazy roller coaster ride of American politics this season.
Isn't it? Can we start just very briefly by talking about what everyone expected the Democratic National Convention to have been if Biden had stayed, and then what they expected it to have been if Biden had gone?
Well, I think the arena itself probably would have been energized either way because the people who attend these things are activists. And the activists like Biden. I think the difference would have been the reception for it. And I think the trepidation around Biden's speech, the sort of crescendo moment on the Thursday night, if he had been the nominee, just because people were frankly worried he was too old. And, you know, when you think about sort of like the way that people define politicians, very often there's a partisan bent to it, right? So like people will look at Trump and on the left, they'll say he's a crazy authoritarian. And on the right, they'll say he's an anti-establishment hero. Both left and right saw Biden as old. And so, you know, that was a huge liability that you had this cross-cutting section of the population that would have been not only paying attention themselves as voters, but also the press would have been paying attention to every word and parsing it for mistakes or stumbles or just not being very sharp. So
of course,
that would have been a huge problem for the Democrats.
What did you think of Biden's farewell actually in the event? What did you think of his speech and the reception that he got?
Well, I think it hit the right tones, and I think the aspects of it underscored that it was clearly the right move for him to pass the torch, because he's not the same politician he was 4 years ago, let alone the same politician he was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something that's shifted fundamentally in how Americans, and especially Democrats, view him since he decided not to run for re-election, which is that these sort of two sides to him. The one side was the sort of shepherd of democracy and the sort of, statesman. That aspect existed. But it was in tension with what a lot of Democrats saw at the time as being selfish in trying to retain power, even though poll after poll showed he was a vulnerable candidate. And now that second part is gone, the Democrats have rallied around him. His approval rating has shot up, and people were incredibly enthusiastic about his speech in the arena.
Yeah, he's become the sort of party's grandfather. Did you make it? Some people made something of the fact that his speech was quite late and it sort of missed prime time, that this was intentional, etc. But the conference has actually overrun every single night, slightly, so that the final speech has always been just outside prime time, even Walz's, even Harris's. So do you think there was anything to that? Do you think he was being snubbed by the party?
No, I don't think so. I think you're right to point to the fact that this was something that overran repeatedly. And it's the only thing that they didn't orchestrate perfectly. I mean, the convention was done exceptionally well on, from a political theater point of view, it was exceptional. The question of, whether they could have done better time management, I think is a minor one, but it wasn't something that was targeting Biden quite clearly. And keep in mind, the U.S. has 4 time zones, and a lot of the swing states are not in the Eastern time zone. Of course, Pennsylvania, one of the main ones, is. You do get a benefit for it being a little bit earlier when it's airing in Arizona, and so on, or Nevada, et cetera. So I think this is pretty much a non-issue in the end.
Yeah, and I think also the way news is consumed now, with clips going viral, etc., it's just completely different to what it used to be when there was one opportunity to basically watch it live on your television, and that was it.
Yes.
What about the practical task of just rebuilding a conference around a new ticket in the space of a month? To be honest, I thought that was the aspect that was going to let it down. I thought it was going to be a little bit disorganized, a little bit technically glitchy, because, every order, every speaker, everything had to change. And in the end, I thought that aspect of it was incredible. It was as if they'd been planning this conference specifically around Harris and Walz for like 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, it was masterful. And I think Democrats often are deeply suspicious of party elites for a variety of different historical reasons and so on. But you look at this conference and you say, the party elites are pretty good. They're doing a really good job with orchestrating this stuff. Part of the reason for that is because they were preparing for the convention already, right? I mean, they swapped the candidate, but they were preparing for this huge event already. The other is that the Biden-Harris transition is going to be more seamless than others because it's part of the same apparatus, right? She is part of the administration. Some of the people already work in the White House, etc. But I do think it was remarkable. And I think, when we talked before on one of the Thursday episodes, what I said to you was that Americans could say one sentence about Kamala Harris. They couldn't say 2. That's now changed, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that was the decisive feature of this, is that they're introducing a new candidate. Even though she's the vice president, she was not well known.
Yeah.
And this is a huge problem for Trump because, it has only been a month, But people are going to start voting in early voting very, very soon. I mean, it's 46 days before the election is the start of early voting in Minnesota, which we're coming up to. So, where I'm from. So it's one of these things where she had a chance to define herself, and Trump trying to brand her in various ways since then. I don't think it's going to compete with the sort of primetime acclamation that she received on Thursday evening.
I hark back to something an analyst had told me around the first Obama election, that what you want to look for are not fans, they're super fans. There's a difference between people being polled, where someone calls them at home and they go, yeah, I'll probably vote for Biden, and this energy that seems to be emanating from the grassroots, where people are fired up to work for the campaign, to volunteer, to knock on doors, to vote early, to register people. Could the tone with the GOP convention have been any different? I mean, we've had 4 years of sleepy Joe Biden, and in the event, the Republican convention looked like the sleepiest, most dull affair in comparison to the sort of jubilation and unity that happened at the DNC. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of Democrats feel like it's 2008 all over again, right? And 2008, when Obama made his ascendancy, was a watershed moment in Democratic Party politics, incredibly high enthusiasm levels. And I think we're in that sort of space. So you're right. This is something where obviously the voters are what matter, but the people who wrangle them to the polls are the enthusiastic participants. And if you looked at data heading into sort of April of this year, I saw a stat that something like 31 or 34% of Democrats were fired up about the election. And before the convention, it was 81%. So that tells you how incredibly different the race has become because of Kamala Harris. And I think, a lot of the Democrats' fears around her were things that were just tropes, basically, in the media. She's not ready for prime time, or she's not effective as a communicator, and so on. And the most effective antidote to that was just to put her out there and show that that wasn't true. And I think even her critics will say she did a good job on the speech and she looked presidential and all these sorts of things. But the sort of fired up nature of this, yeah, you're right. I mean, the Republican convention, there's a great montage on American morning cable TV on MSNBC where they showed the roll call, where they go through all the states.
I saw that. It was extraordinary.
And it's sort of, it's like they sort of, name the various states, the Republican ones, and everyone sort of goes, woo, And then, like, the Democrats get to it. Everyone is incredibly enthusiastic. And then they get to Georgia, and Little John, comes through and sings this, what basically blends one of his top 40 hits with party politics messages. I mean, it was a party. It was a party, and I think that's the kind of thing that you need to excite people down the home stretch.
Quiet, Riot. If you were to choose one, let's say, lesser-known speaker that really impressed you, who would that be?
I think, I don't know if he's lesser known, but I'm going to pick Tim Walz for this. He's my governor. I'm a Minnesotan myself. And I think what's really remarkable about him and
you've worked on a Minnesotan gubernatorial race before, haven't you? I seem to remember in the back of my head.
Yes, I was the deputy campaign manager, so one of the people that co-managed the campaign, that was for his predecessor. So we sort of paved the groundwork.
So you really know the politics of that state.
Yes, yeah, we laid the groundwork for Walz, because he was the immediate successor to our candidate. What's really interesting about Walz is when you talk to people in sort of political messaging or political consulting, they always say, authenticity, down to earth, common man sort of stuff. And you look at that speech that he gave, which was, it hit those notes perfectly. And you sort of think, maybe the Democrats needed a teacher a bit sooner, right? Or somebody like this. Because it's just so hard to attack this person when he is clearly someone who's devoted his life and career to general public service, not political public service, but trying to serve his community. And what's remarkable about him, and what really angers the right about Walz, and this is why he gets so much vitriol, even though it's not really cutting through with voters, is he is exactly what a lot of the Republican elites pretend to be, right? So there's this whole shtick in Republican Party politics of being sort of the rural party of, working class, what they call quote unquote real Americans. And then, all of them live in DC in these penthouses and have, huge stock portfolios and are multimillionaires. Tim Walz is not. He's from, he was a teacher. He's from Nebraska originally, but he was a teacher in Mankato, Minnesota, as rural a community as you get. And, I think he's the kind of person that moves the dial with those undecided voters in the swing states who vote Democrat or Republican, depending on who the candidate is. And that is going to be the deciding factor, I think, in this election.
I love this guy. Tim is the kind of person who should be in politics. Born in a small town, served his country, taught kids, coached football, took care of his neighbors. He knows who he is, and he knows what's important. You can tell those flannel shirts he wears don't come from some political consultant. They come from his closet, and they have been through some stuff.
You're so right. I think his superpower and the reason he's been such kryptonite for the Trump campaign is that they have spent a long time telling people they are not like you. They don't care about you. They don't understand your life. And up pops Tim Walz, who is like them, entirely like them. He's their neighbor. They know that guy. And suddenly it makes that Trump attack, that they're not like you, very hollow, very tinny, I think. The part that's impressed me is the political technique of giving the spotlight over to real-life stories, like Hadley Duval, who I thought was exceptional. In fact, let's hear a little bit from her.
I was raped by my stepfather after years of sexual abuse. At age 12, I took my first pregnancy test, and it was positive. That was the first time I was ever told, you have options. I can't imagine not having a choice. But today, that's the reality for many women and girls across the country because of Donald Trump's abortion bans. He calls it a beautiful thing. What is so beautiful about a child having to carry her parent's child? There are other survivors out there who have no options. And I want you to know that we see you. We hear you.
Expanding, I think, the abortion debate into reproductive rights is quite an inspired move, because it suddenly takes in a whole load of other people who may not think of themselves as someone who would ever want to have an abortion, but who may think of themselves as the sort of people that may need IVF or know people that have IVF. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that the Republicans have sort of made a catastrophic political calculation with the Roe v. Wade politics and what they've done since it. Because they're in sort of a catch-22, which is that their base is demanding that they do this, even though it is political suicide in many parts of the country that they need to win. And what the Republicans maybe didn't count on, and what you're pointing to, is not only that the sort of perception around this is that this is not just about abortion, right? This is not just about cases where someone, has an accidental pregnancy and wants an abortion or whatever it is. This is about reproductive rights as a suite of policies. And it's also about attacks on women. And the gender differential in this election is going to be enormous. But they also didn't factor in what Democrats have responded to this with, which is ballot measures in key states that are around reprotecting reproductive rights and abortion access. And so, you look at some of the swing states, Arizona and Nevada both have ballot measures, as does Florida, around sort of basically undoing what has happened since Roe v. Wade was overturned and re-enshrining some of the protections for women. And that stuff, that will drive voters to the polls who might not otherwise vote. So it's not even about the question of, is this a point for the Democrats? It's that you're actually going to expand the pool of voters because there are people who care about these issues who don't normally vote. I mean, turnout in presidential elections in a good year is something like 60%. If that goes up to 62% because of these measures in these states, all of a sudden that's the margin that will win the Democrats the White House.
She understands that most of us will never be afforded the grace of failing forward. We will never benefit from the affirmative action of generational wealth. If we bankrupt a business or choke in a crisis, we don't get a second, third, or fourth chance. If things don't go our way, we don't have the luxury of whining or cheating others to get further ahead. No. We don't get to change the rules so we always win. If we see a mountain in front of us, we don't expect there to be an escalator waiting to take us to the top. No. We put our heads down. We get to work. In America, we do something.
Now, the Obamas, they are stardust. In oratory terms, I think they are untouchable right now. But what did you think they added to the campaign, the debate going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the sort of, extremely positive embrace was a signal, right, that the establishment is behind her. And that was important because it was a stark contrast with Trump. I mean, the fact that there were no previous Republican, not just presidents, but, most of the senior political figures of the last 25 years were nowhere near their RNC because they don't want to be associated with Trump, let alone his old vice president, right, who his mob tried to kill him, basically. So that was a stark contrast. I also think it's something where they can highlight issues around, sort of attacking Trump or belittling Trump. Barack Obama made a joke about Donald Trump's crowd size, as it were.
Yes.
and this sort of stuff is something that Harris shouldn't do and wouldn't do probably, and Obama can. And Michelle Obama can, talk. I thought one of the best lines that she had was she referred to the, quote, affirmative action of generational wealth.
Yes. That section of the speech where she said, when the rest of us see a mountain, we don't expect an escalator to take us to the top. Yeah. I thought was incredible.
Yeah, well, it's also what they're so good at, and I think this is what the Democrats are starting to sort of fight on. It was a marked contrast from the sort of when they go low, we go high rhetoric of the sort of Obama presidency, was actually saying, we're not going to let them set the terms for these things. When they talk about affirmative action as though it's something that's, pernicious, what about the affirmative action that happens when you inherit hundreds of millions of dollars?
Yeah.
And this is the kind of stuff where I think it's a different kind of Democratic Party that is saying, we will actually push back because we're not just going to say we're the sort of aloof party that never gets into the fight. And Kamala Harris's, slogan of "When we fight, we win" is an indication of exactly this strategic shift.
From Pete Buttigieg all the way to Dana Nessel, many, many others, LGBTQ plus rights were really very present at this convention, I thought.
By the way, I got a message for the Republicans and the justices of the United States Supreme Court. You can pry this wedding band from my cold, dead, gay hand.
It's a part of the Democratic base, for sure. It's also something where this is part, following on from what I just said, this is part of reclaiming narratives around things like family values, right? It's saying, hold on, the whole debate around this in the U.S. has been that it has to look like a white, suburban, middle-class family, heterosexual family and so on, and it has to be that. When you have Pete Buttigieg, who has obviously a very good family life at home and so on, this is something where they're trying to say, you don't get to define what being an American is. And Michelle Obama had a line about this, where she's basically said, there's not just one form of being an American. And again, I think this is the kind of stuff where what Democrats might have done, 15 or 20 years ago, is look at some of these issues and sort of say, well, this might possibly turn off a voter in, a sort of rural area in middle America. And instead, I think what they're trying to do is to say, look, this is who we are as a country, and that's a strength. And it's very smart politics. It's also possible because LGBTQ rights in the U.S. have changed radically in the last 15 years. I mean, it's just the polling on this has flipped dramatically in a very short period of time in terms of you'd have to go into sort of the evangelical part of Donald Trump's base to get to people who want to overturn gay marriage, for example, in the United States. So that's a seismic shift in some of the aspects of this as well.
And also, I think Tim Walz's neurodivergent son, that seemed to create quite a lot of churn over at the Trump camp. Some of his typically toxic proxies made fun of it. I wonder if he will be able to resist making fun of Tim Walz's son himself, actually, at some point. But again, that turned around and you had a lot of people coming out and saying, you don't get to define what masculine is. Your brand of masculine is not the only that exists out there. And I thought that was also quite a clever way to say to a lot of male voters, you are welcome.
Yeah, this is why I want, Tim Walz to sort of take this up because, and the attacks on his son, which are just despicable, and really highlight the difference between the meanness of the RNC and the sort of hope of the DNC, is that I think there is a cultural problem that is sort of universal in Western society right now, that masculinity is a sort of insecure masculinity, domineering masculinity, the Andrew Tate version. Or in the US, like, let me show you how big my gun is and shoot it to show you that I'm a true man. And I think what Tim Walz is trying to do, and I think, it's a very welcome intervention, is to say, actually, some of the things that are quote-unquote masculine traits are, being a good dad, or thinking about your community, or being a good neighbor, or being a kind person. And that is something that I think is a long overdue correction to men who feel, sort of rudderless in 2024, turning to YouTube and looking at Andrew Tate videos, or thinking that somehow the sort of Trump coalition, which has, just laced with misogyny, that's the way to project a masculine outlook. I think that's one of the major sea changes that could happen culturally, just because the sort of Coach Walz aspect of him is so sort of heartwarming and clear to people that it brings the conversation to the forefront.
And it's interesting that Trump attacked precisely that in a rather pathetic way.
I see an America where we care for one another, look out for one another, and recognize that we have so much more in common than what separates us. That none of us has to fail for all of us to succeed. And that in unity there is strength. Our opponents in this race are out there every day denigrating America, talking about how terrible everything is. Well, my mother had another lesson she used to teach. Never let anyone tell you who you are. You show them who you are. America, let us show each other and the world who we are and what we stand for. Freedom, opportunity, compassion, dignity, fairness, and endless possibilities.
Now, turning to the big one, Kamala Harris's speech, the sort of crescendo that everything was driving towards. What did you think of it?
I think it was probably not the best speech of the convention because she was, against some of the most impressive orators in American history. But it did everything it needed to do perfectly. And I think what was striking about it as well, and I saw some people commenting on this around the speech, was that they said, Donald Trump's strategy that you can tell from the RNC is to go from 42% to 47% of the electorate. Kamala Harris is trying to get to 52% of the electorate. In other words, she's trying to win over people that don't naturally vote for her. And that is where you saw some of the things that weren't just hitting Democratic notes, but, she brought up the border. She brought up some of the things that are not obvious strong suits for the Democrats, including Gaza. And she tried to sort of strike a balance with these things to say, look, we care about Gaza, but we are also pro-Israel. We have a problem at the border, and we're trying to solve it, but Donald Trump blocked it. And I think that was the kind of stuff where she's an astute politician who understands that growing your coalition is the way you win elections, and that was what was on display on Thursday.
There is a shift in politics that I am surprised how many people have failed to pick up. The last 15 years, we've seen a global financial crisis, we've seen a pandemic, we've seen wars in places that we never thought would go to war again. In Britain, we've seen Brexit. There's been a huge amount of change. And I think a lot of people realize that actually detailed policy is quite a useless thing to talk about before an election, because something will happen that will derail everything you plan to do. That has been the recent pattern. What's more important is your values, your priorities. What they want to know is when you're faced with that next pandemic, that next war, that next financial crisis, how will you respond to it? What will you prioritize? And I see a lot of complaints about not enough detail about inflation. And I just think that is misreading the mood.
I think you're right about this. I also think it's a hallmark of a different political culture. I mean, one of the things that I think is very, very good about UK politics is that there's sort of this adversarial journalism where the people get pressed for details. The US version of that is just sort of gotcha attempts to try to create controversy. It's not actually trying to get in the weeds. Right? They're not trying to figure out exactly what she would do. They're trying to create a story. And so I think you're right that there is this aspect of people just want to know what kind of person you are. And that was very important. And strategically, she probably is making the right move to be somewhat vague on contentious issues. But rest assured, Kamala Harris has people who care about policy in her orbit, and I guarantee you she will have plans on day one. I mean, there's no question about this. Plus, she's part of the Biden administration, so you have a rough proxy of sort of what she might do based on what she has done as part of that organization for the last 4 years.
Now, just to wrap it up, because I know you have to go very soon, the reaction of Trump and the Trump camp. We saw him sort of rage tweeting during her speech and then rage dialing into Fox News, who actually had to cut him off. And he was also pressing buttons during talking to him. I mean, it sounded a little bit insane.
She's going to give a tax increase of 4 to 5 times what people and companies are paying right now. He said, look, he was treated very unfairly by the Democrats. Yeah. He would have beaten Joe Biden in a Democrat primary. I have no doubt about it. And they made it absolutely impossible for him. They made it that you have to get 60, 70% of the vote just to get in. And you know what? President. In the end, the Democrats did the same thing to Joe Biden. They threw Joe Biden out of the party.
And that's why we saw a different night tonight.
Mr. President, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate that live feedback.
And then you have J.D. Vance that just seems to have gone down like a lead balloon.
Okay, yeah. She doesn't want to be on film, guys, so just cut her out of anything. Appreciate that, man. I'm J.D. Vance. I'm running for Vice President of Tennessee.
Okay.
Do you think there is a reasonable chance that he will turn against Vance?
I don't know if he'll turn against him because at this point he can't really change. But I think that Vance might take a back seat. I mean, he's clearly a political liability, and Walz basically strengthened Harris's bid for the White House. I think Vance amplified every weakness that Trump has. He's a weird authoritarian extremist, and people see him that way. And he's very uncharismatic. It was a huge mistake.
Now, the polling, all of it is moving in the right direction. It's beginning to manifest down ballot. But the glum reading of all this could be that this is the high watermark for Harris. This is her honeymoon. This is her convention. She's riding a wave, and she will never be more popular than she is now. What are the traps for her, do you think, between now and the big debate on September 10th?
Well, I don't think there's going to be... I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I think that is basically the next big trap. If she screws that up, that could be a problem that could reset the narrative of the campaign. But as I say before, because of changes in voting laws, people don't just cast ballots in November anymore. And she's going to start racking up votes shortly after that debate, basically. So I think time is running out to define her from the Republican side of things, and Trump has been incredibly unfocused in this regard. If I were a betting man today, I would say she'll win the election. But, lots can change. As we said 6 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, none of this had happened. So, never say never in American politics.
I guess I'm just expecting that the attacks at some point will get better than, oh my God, she eats Doritos. And we've seen, I don't know if you've seen the January 6th ad that the Harris camp have put out. I think it's devastating, absolutely devastating for Trump. And so I guess I'm worried because I can't see any form of a plan or a strategy. And that worries me because I think, well, they have a huge professional team around them and loads of money. There must be a plan or a strategy, right?
Well, I think they were caught on the back foot. I think that's the answer. I think they geared up to run against Biden, and now they're running against Harris, and they weren't ready.
Yeah, they were surprised by this entirely predictable thing that they've been calling for. Huge thanks to our gorgeous compadre, Brian Klaas.
Thanks for having me on the show. It was great.
Thank you, Brian.
Quiet Riot.
And that's this week's Quiet Riot Sunday School all done. Brian will be joining us on the full panel show after that big debate on the 10th of September. Remember, you can now support us on ko-fi.com Quiet Riot Pod. That's ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. And I would strongly suggest that you do. We are spending every waking hour working on this, but the costs are pretty eye-watering, and the advertising is scarce. We are completely independent and want to stay that way. So if you can afford to, help us keep making this special little pod and spread the word on social media. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. We will be back soon.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Hey guys, JD Vance here in Radford, Virginia. I thought I'd take you behind the scenes a little bit. When you get to an event, they've got a ton of crap for you to drink and eat. You got 3 bottles of Diet Mountain Dew, about a dozen Snickers, a bag of chips. If I ate even half this stuff, of course, I'd balloon up like crazy. This is the energy that powers the presidential and vice presidential.